Organizers expect millions of people to take part in a third round of the No Kings protests across the country today. Organizers say the rallies are intended to show opposition to President Trump's policies, as well as the war in Iran. Nearly 7 million people attended No Kings protests last fall. This one's expected to be even bigger. Joining me now for more is co-president of Public Citizen, Lisa Gilbert. Lisa, it is good to see you. Thank you for being here. How are people preparing for today's events? How many people do you expect to march across the country?
Well, we have a record number of events, 3,300 around the country. To put that in perspective, there are only 3,150 counties in the whole nation. So there will be an event literally anywhere that you could hope to attend one. We will see RSVPs from folks in rural areas, in suburban areas, in urban areas. It's a true mass movement, and I'm expecting joyful protest, shared resolve as we all grapple with the realities of this authoritarian slide that we've been experiencing, this sort of wannabe dictator persona that Trump has adopted as he moves us into an illegal war.
Hey friends, welcome. David is here. So, what just happened? Millions of Americans flooded the streets for the third wave of a sustained organized movement under one banner, No Kings. This wasn't just a single protest that disappears by morning. This was a rapidly accelerating movement in cities too numerous to ignore. The numbers were too vast for Capitol Hill to dismiss as fringe.
Today, protesters across this country took to the streets as part of the latest No Kings demonstration against President Trump and his administration. Among the biggest rallies right there in St. Paul, Minnesota, outside the state capitol. CBS's Christian Benavidez is in West Palm Beach, Florida, near the president's home. Christian.
Jerika, this is the third round of No Kings protests. Organizers say that they expect these crowds to be the largest. And in that Minnesota rally, officials there prepared for a crowd of over 150,000 people.
The message is simple, and it cuts through every spin cycle. They believe the president has crossed the line that separates an elected leader from something far more dangerous. And that message, written on signs held by millions of bodies in public squares across the country, is one no press secretary can translate away. This isn't something that can be ignored or brushed aside.
That's right, guys. We're talking about the sights, the sounds, the signs, and most importantly, the passions of the people. It's the No Kings rally from right here in Washington, D.C. Thousands of demonstrators gathered on Saturday morning at Memorial Circle in Arlington, Virginia, with a desire to have their collective voices heard. Protesters were armed with signs, with slogans, with banners expressing their displeasure with President Trump as well as his administration. Now the march, it began at 10 a.m. as the droves in attendance sang and chanted in unity for their common cause. And in what was described as a powerful moment, the march matriculated across the Memorial Bridge, moving from Virginia into the nation's capital.
Major news organizations from every corner of the world have pointed their cameras at the streets of America. And what they're capturing is absolutely jaw-dropping. The images are impossible to ignore. In New York City, the crowd stretched for blocks and blocks, a massive wave of people all moving with one clear purpose in mind. In Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, and even right at the doorstep of the nation's capital, the exact same scene is playing out. No city is being left out of this.
While Americans gathered at more than 3,000 No Kings protests around the country.
He promised no new wars. He promised to be the America First president, and this sure does not look like that.
Protests were also held worldwide, including in Rome, Madrid, and Paris. The White House has dubbed the rallies Trump derangement therapy sessions.
This is not a mental therapy. This is showing them that we can be strong and we can have democracy again.
Among the largest crowds in Minnesota, where immigration enforcement reached a flashpoint earlier this year.
With everything that's going on, I feel powerless, and today, in this moment, I feel like I do have a little bit of power.
The rallies come as the president says he is looking to wind down the war with Iran.
The National Mall, that sacred historic ground where civil rights warriors and anti-war protesters once made history, is packed once again with everyday citizens demanding to be heard. They are assembling, they are speaking out loud and proud, and they are taking their grievances straight to the government's front door, making it crystal clear that these issues simply cannot wait any longer. This is the First Amendment in action, raw, powerful, and impossible to silence.
Hundreds of thousands marched today in No Kings rallies all across the country, including a huge march in downtown D.C. Those rallies were aimed at the Trump administration, with protests taking aim at everything from the war with Iran to the higher cost of living. The march in D.C. crossed Memorial Bridge in Arlington and marched along the mall.
This isn't about one single policy or one single bill. This is so much bigger than that. When you step back and look at everything together, a deeply disturbing picture emerges of an executive branch that has deliberately tried to place itself above the courts, above Congress, and beyond the reach of the American people. The protesters aren't just unhappy, they are genuinely alarmed, and they've made that alarm impossible to ignore, taking it to the streets on a scale so massive that every single elected official in Washington has no choice but to pay attention. The fact that this is being called the third wave tells you everything you need to know about where this movement is headed. This is not a one-time explosion of anger that fades overnight. The first wave hit early in the administration when citizens reacted in shock to a string of aggressive executive actions. The second wave, which peaked months ago, proved the anger wasn't cooling down. Over 100,000 people flooded the streets of New York City alone during that mobilization. That number alone showed this was a movement with deep roots and serious organizational power. And now the third wave is here, and by every single measure available, it is larger, more coordinated, and more intense than anything that came before. The energy is not dying down, it is building on itself. Every new controversy, every new revelation of executive overreach, every new policy that squeezes ordinary families adds more fuel to a fire that is now burning stronger than ever. This movement has reached a point where it simply cannot be brushed aside or laughed off by the political class anymore. The specific grievances that have driven millions into the streets cover the full range of this administration's most controversial actions, and some of them are absolutely heartbreaking. Take immigration enforcement. The names Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretty have become rallying cries across the country. These were American citizens, whose lives were cut short during an immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota. The exact details are still being investigated and fiercely debated, but the core fact cannot be denied. 2 Americans lost their lives in the course of an enforcement action driven by the administration's aggressive deportation agenda. For the families who loved them, for the communities that knew them, and for the protesters now carrying their names on signs and chanting them in the streets, these deaths are not statistics. They are proof of a system that has chosen the projection of force over the protection of human life. The protesters are demanding accountability. They want to know who gave the orders, who set the rules of engagement, and who will be held responsible for the loss of American lives. Then there is the matter of war, and the Constitution could not be clearer on this point. The power to declare war belongs to Congress, and Congress alone. Yet this administration launched a major military campaign without seeking or receiving any congressional authorization whatsoever. The conflict with Iran, which was supposed to be swift and decisive, has instead turned into a quagmire. American service members have died, strategic objectives remain unmet, and gas prices have surged to painful levels that hit working families every single day just trying to get to work and take their kids to school. The protesters see this war as the ultimate proof of an imperial presidency, a president who believes he can send young Americans into harm's way on his authority alone, with no debate, no vote, and zero accountability. And when threats of annihilation against civilian populations were broadcast to the entire world, the protesters heard the language of a tyrant, not the measured, restrained words of a commander-in-chief bound by the laws of armed conflict. The economic pain that everyday Americans are living through provides the backdrop for all of this outrage, and it is raw and real. This president campaigned on a promise of affordability. He spoke directly to working families struggling with groceries, housing, and just getting by day to day. But those same families are now standing at supermarket checkouts staring at prices that refuse to come down. They look at the gas pump and watch their paychecks disappear. And then they turn on the news and see reports of a $400 ballroom project being pursued by the president using public resources for what looks like nothing more than personal vanity and political favoritism. The gap between the rhetoric of fighting for the working class and the reality of policies that seem to benefit the wealthy and well-connected while squeezing everyone else, that gap is a chasm, and the protesters are absolutely determined to put it on full display. The effigies of the president and vice president being set ablaze at these rallies are not just symbolic gestures. They are raw, visceral expressions of a belief that these leaders have betrayed the trust of the very people who put them in power. The White House response to this massive outpouring of Democratic participation has been, to put it plainly, deeply dismissive. The protests have been described as therapy sessions for people suffering from an irrational obsession. The suggestion has even been floated that only paid journalists and professional agitators could possibly care about the issues being raised. This is the response of an administration that has chosen to live in a bubble where millions of Americans peacefully assembling to voice real concerns simply do not exist or do not count. And that response doesn't calm anything down. It pours gasoline on the fire. When citizens are exercising their most sacred constitutional rights and the response from the top is mockery and denial, it confirms exactly what the protesters are already saying. It proves in their minds that the president views the people not as his employers to whom he answers, but as subjects to be managed or ignored. The claim that the opposition is manufactured or paid for is a classic move straight out of the authoritarian playbook, used by leaders throughout history to delegitimize dissent, and its use by this White House has only made the No Kings framing of this entire movement feel even more justified. The name No Kings is not a random slogan. It is a direct callback to the very founding of America. The revolution that created this nation was fought first and foremost against monarchy. The framers of the Constitution deliberately designed a system with multiple competing branches of government specifically to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. The presidency was built with significant authority, but that authority was always meant to be checked by Congress and the courts. The protesters are making a very specific constitutional argument that the current occupant of the Oval Office has rejected this foundational principle entirely. They point to the systematic disregard for court orders. They point to the unilateral launch of military action without congressional consent. They point to the use of executive authority to punish political enemies and reward loyalists. And their conclusion is damning. This is not just aggressive executive action. This is the behavior of someone who genuinely believes he is a king. The deaths of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Priddy have become the human face of this constitutional crisis, and the details that have emerged are deeply troubling. An immigration raid was conducted, a confrontation ensued, and 2 Americans, people whose citizenship should have placed them firmly under the Constitution's protection, were killed. For the protesters, this is the inevitable consequence of an enforcement-first, rights-last approach to immigration. When the rhetoric from the top dehumanizes entire communities and encourages aggressive tactics, the likelihood of tragic outcomes skyrockets. The families of Good and Priddy are not just grieving. They are demanding answers, and the protesters have taken up their cause, carrying their names as a shield against the administration's attempts to frame the immigration debate purely in terms of law and order. The burning of effigies is a form of political theater with deep historical roots, from the burning of King George III in colonial America to protests against unpopular leaders throughout history. Setting fire to a likeness carries a specific symbolic weight. It is a public declaration that the individual represented has forfeited their legitimacy. When protesters set fire to representations of the president and vice president, they are saying in the most visually powerful way possible that these individuals are not fit to hold the offices they occupy. Those images, captured on millions of cell phones and spread across social media, are now seared into the public consciousness, the defining images of a nation in open revolt against its own leadership. The call for criminal prosecution adds yet another explosive layer to the protesters' demands. They are not satisfied with removal from office through impeachment or the 25th Amendment. They believe the conduct in question rises all the way to the level of criminality. They point to threats of civilizational annihilation as potential war crimes. They point to the firing of officials who refuse to carry out illegal orders as obstruction of justice. They point to the Ballroom Project as potential corruption. And they are demanding that once the political obstacles are cleared, the justice system holds the president accountable, just like any other citizen who breaks the law would be held accountable. The organizational infrastructure behind 3 successive waves of mass mobilization on this scale should absolutely not be underestimated. This is not a handful of people with a Facebook page. This is a sophisticated, distributed network of organizers who have learned the lessons of previous social movements. They coordinate across cities, navigate complex permitting processes, arrange sound systems, portable restrooms, and medical support, and develop unified messaging that resonates across different communities and different regions. They recruit and train marshals to keep the peace and de-escalate conflicts. This level of organization signals a movement with serious staying power, one that is not dependent on a single charismatic leader and will not simply fade away after the next election. The economic dimension of these protests is crucial to understanding why they have such broad appeal. The president's approval ratings have taken a serious hit as economic realities have set in. The promises of immediate relief and affordable abundance have not materialized. Instead, families are dealing with persistent inflation, high interest rates, and an uncertain job market. A recent report showing negative job growth sent shockwaves through the economic community and confirmed the fears of millions of ordinary Americans that things are heading in the wrong direction. The protesters are connecting this economic pain directly to the president's policy choices, the war in Iran driving up gas prices, trade wars and tariff schemes disrupting supply chains, and the overall climate of political chaos making businesses hesitant to invest and hire. The international dimension of these protests is equally significant. The whole world is watching, and it is not a flattering picture. When global news organizations like the BBC dedicate significant airtime to covering mass demonstrations in the United States, it sends a powerful signal to allies and adversaries alike. It signals that the American political system is under severe strain. For allies who depend on American stability and reliability, these images are deeply unsettling, raising serious questions about the future of American democracy and the credibility of American leadership on the world stage. For adversaries, the protests are a propaganda gift, evidence that the American model is failing and that the United States is in no position to lecture anyone about democracy. The president, who cares deeply about the perception of American strength, is being humiliated on the international stage by the very citizens he claims to lead. The impact of these protests on Congress is already being felt, and the pressure is building. Members of Congress, especially those in competitive districts, are acutely aware of the crowds in the streets. They see the signs, they hear the chants, and they are reading the polling data showing the president's approval rating stuck below 40%, with opposition intensity growing by the day. The protests create a permission structure. They give Republicans who have privately harbored concerns about the president's conduct a reason to start voicing those concerns publicly. When millions of constituents are marching under a No Kings banner, a Republican senator can justify a break with the president by pointing to the legitimate concerns of the people they represent. The protests are accelerating the erosion of the president's political coalition, and the timing could not be more dangerous for him. The pressure on the cabinet to consider the 25th Amendment is one of the most direct and tangible goals of parts of this movement, and the tactics being used are personal. Demonstrations are not confined to the National Mall and large public squares. They are also showing up in the neighborhoods where cabinet secretaries actually live. The strategy is deliberate. It is one thing to read about protests in a briefing memo, but it is something else entirely to have to navigate a crowd of demonstrators outside your own front door, to have your family hear the chants demanding that you act to remove the president. This kind of direct personal pressure can have a profound psychological effect, raising the personal stakes and forcing cabinet members to confront the reality that their service is not just a policy debate, but an intense moral and political contest. The possibility of violence is the dark shadow hanging over every mass mobilization, and no one can afford to ignore it. The vast majority of protesters are peaceful. They are there to exercise their constitutional rights, not to cause destruction. But large crowds in highly charged political environments carry inherent risks. The presence of counter-protesters, the potential for provocateurs, the possibility of an overzealous or poorly trained law enforcement response, any of these could spark a confrontation that spirals out of control. If violence were to erupt and result in serious injury or loss of life, the political calculus would shift dramatically and immediately. Congress might feel compelled to act on impeachment right away. The cabinet might feel that invoking the 25th Amendment is the only way to restore order. The president himself might calculate that resignation is the only way to prevent a deeper catastrophe. The movement operates in the shadow of this possibility, hoping to achieve its goals peacefully, but fully aware that the stakes could not be higher. Here is the consolidated reality, and it is impossible to spin away. The streets of America are filled with citizens who have concluded that their president is acting like a king rather than a public servant. They are mobilizing in waves, each one larger than the last, under the banner of No Kings. The movement is fueled by constitutional alarm, economic pain, and the devastating human cost of aggressive policies. The deaths of Americans during immigration enforcement have given the movement a powerful moral focal point. The president's contemptuous response has only validated the protesters' critique. The movement is organized, sustained, and growing, creating conditions that make it increasingly difficult for Republicans to hold the line. pressuring the cabinet directly and embarrassing the nation on the global stage, the people are speaking loudly, clearly, and in numbers that cannot be ignored. The question is no longer whether they are being heard. The question is what those in power will do in response, and the whole world is watching for the answer.